So I am awaiting again just for a few more people to come on. We are talking about deepening relationships in 2021. I was thinking about how, just thinking this morning about the things that I would love to get better in, that I would love to improve more. And one of the things that I thought about was just deepening my current relationships and also cultivating new relationships. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about just what that's all about in deepening relationships. And so the first thing that I talked about, that for those of you who watch me, you know that a lot of times I kind of speak in acronyms. And so I wanted to talk about this. And then again, I really just wanted to share some tips and some important aspects of deepening our relationship and what it means to our growth and development. And so, again, if you read the headline of this live or in the description of this live, it says a better me makes a better us. And it's important, to really highlight that because a lot of times people are under the impression that it takes two people to make a relationship work. And I agree. I agree that it takes two people to make a relationship. But I also think that if one person is committed to growing individually, it can also impact the relationship. Yes, it takes two people to make a relationship work, but aspects of your relationship can definitely change if you are willing and you are committed to growing. And I'll even say that in marriage. And a lot of times when I work with couples, when I work with couples and doing therapy with them, sometimes couples say to me, well, my husband, he doesn't want to go, come to therapy, or my wife, she doesn't want to come to therapy. And one of the things that I say all the time is, well, you continue to come, because sometimes that one person that commits to changing and growing can change the dynamics of a relationship if they are willing to work on themselves. Does it mean that that other person doesn't need to work on themselves? Absolutely not. But what it means is if I focus on me and I work on the things that will make me a better person, I guarantee that it will also improve the relationship, or it will either clarify more that maybe the relationship is not conducive to my presence. So it's important for you. And that's tip number one. If you're in a marriage and maybe you know that there's some hardships and there's some difficulties in the marriage, and you've asked your spouse to get, to go to counseling, if they choose not to, you go. And you begin to work on you. You begin to work on the areas in you that can change the relationship, which will ultimately change your relationship with your significant other. Again, Happy New Year. It does not mean that the other person does not need to change, but what it means is you are making a commitment to be better. And so, for those of you who just come on, we're talking about we are talking about deepening relationships, and I always work through acronyms. And so my acronym for today is better. Okay, a better me makes a better us. And this can apply in relationships with our significant others, with our children, with our colleagues and our business partners. It doesn't matter. What are the areas in you that need to change, right? And so, B, the first thing that I'm going to say about and deepening your relationship is that there has to be a hierarchy in mind, okay? What do I mean by that? My frame of reference in every one of my relationships is simply this: God, me, then you, okay? Do not put another person where God should be. Do not put yourself where God should be. Deepening our relationships has everything to do with respecting the hierarchy as it relates to submission and devotion. And so, what we're talking about is this whole idea that guess what? God is first in everything that I do. He's first in my relationships, whether it is my marriage, my friendships, whether it is in my business affairs, whether it is in my employment. God is first. And because He is first, I will honor Him in my relationships. If He can't be honored in my relationships, if His word can't be honored in my relationships, then my relationships are ineffective. So the first tip is to respect and honor the hierarchy in your relationships. We're talking about deepening relationships. So it's God first, it's you second, and then it's all others after that. Okay, the Bible talks about how we are to love others as we love ourselves. So there's an understanding that self-love has to be present in our lives. Our love for God will guide our interactions. They will guide, it guides our behavior. It guides our character. And so when we think about ourselves, when we honor ourselves, we won't enter into relationships that are counterproductive to our happiness and our success. We won't allow ourselves to be in abusive and toxic relationships because we love ourselves enough to know that we deserve better. Okay, so we are talking about honoring God, honoring ourselves, and then honoring others. There is a hierarchy. You know, how many times have we been in relationships where we made other people our gods, right? You know, come on, let's be honest. There have been times in our lives where we have made people gods. We have placed them on a pedestal and placed them in situations that really controlled our life. And so when we talk about understanding the balance of it all in relationships, we have to honor God. We have to make ourselves a priority. And then of course, then deal with others. Okay, so we have to look at that balance. And then for those of you who watch my messages, here's my favorite B: boundaries. Balance and boundaries are key in relationships. When we're talking about that hierarchy, when we're talking about God first, you being priority, and then others, it's the same with boundaries. You set your boundaries and you allow your boundaries to be established in your relationships. Okay, abuse is never tolerated in a relationship, whether it is emotional, whether it is mental or physical. So whenever there are instances of abuse taking place in relationships, you have to remove yourself until that behavior is changed, or you have to establish boundaries that will then cultivate a new behavior in that relationships. What do I mean by that? Some people are emotionally abusive because of their past circumstances or trauma that they may have experienced. And if you are in a marriage, you know, you might have had the instances where maybe you were abusive verbally or mentally towards your spouse, and or you know, maybe your spouse was mentally and and emotionally abusive towards you. Does that automatically mean that you are to divorce? I am not saying that at all, but what I am saying is that you have to establish a boundary as it relates to what you will accept and what you will not accept. And once that boundary is established, you have to be consistent, right? You have to be consistent as it relates to maintaining that boundary. And so it gets to that place where, you know, maybe forgiveness is employed. But once you understand that that is a part of the nature of that person in terms of being abusive, you have to make a decision to either remove yourself from that, right? Or continue to demand for growth of that other person. But again, people are only going to grow at the point they are willing to. So again, abuse is should be never accepted or tolerated in a relationship. But there are instances where people can grow past that, those instances of mental and emotional abuse and gain a better relationship. But it definitely comes with work and also setting those boundaries. So we talked about B. The E is embracing differences and difficulties as challenges, but not necessarily the end of a relationship. Some of us are so kind of set in our ways, and we don't always embrace the differences of others, right? Thinking about in a marriage situation, husbands and wives can be so different, whether it's our friendships or our children, they can be so different than us. And there's a tendency at times for us to make everything different about us wrong or inappropriate. And so, part of deepening our relationships with other people has to do with embracing differences and difficulties. There are challenges, there are arguments, there are very difficult times in our relationships, but it doesn't always mean, right, that that relationship is not good. It doesn't always mean that that relationship isn't healthy. Maybe we just have to learn how to understand one another more, right? Oftentimes we get into relationships and it's almost like we're like, oh, this is not going to work because so and so think this way and I don't agree, so it's not going to work. We have to get to the place where we embrace differences and we are able to see them as an asset to our relationship and not necessarily a threat to the relationship. Have you ever been in a relationship where you guys were so very different and you saw that as a threat as opposed to seeing it as as a positive in the relationship? And it oftentimes take place when you have like introverts and extroverts, and so we develop these opinions and these judgments about the other person because they're very different than us. And then we may say belittling things to them, we may say condescending things to them. Why? Because we think that their way is not the right way. And that's not fair. We have to learn how to embrace the differences of other people. We can't be so quick to judge people and write people off because they don't do things the way we would want them to do. Now, again, I'm not talking about abuse. I'm not talking about violating the rights of other people. No, I'm not saying that. That should never be condoned. But what I am saying is learn to respect and embrace the differences of others. Just because they won't approach a situation the way you will, don't make them think that you're better than them or that they're wrong because they're approaching it a different way than you would. And a lot of times this happens in marriages. Y'all, I've been married for 22 years. And there have been times in my relationship where, maybe I told my husband about something or maybe my husband told me about something. And of course, I inserted my opinion. Well, like you really should do it this way. And then he's like, no, I'm going to do it this way. And then I'm saying, see, that's you always do that. And that's why you always get. Are y'all with me? Like, how many times have you been in these conversations with people where you want them to do something your way and they're looking at you and they're saying, no, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way. And then you begin to down or belittle them because they don't want to do it your way. And so we're talking about embracing the differences of others because sometimes you just got to learn to, learn and really be willing to understand the other person's perspective, right? And so that is something that you really, really have to get better in. I'm going to tell y'all a funny story that happened when my husband and I, we were like a year into marriage. And this turned out into like a big kind of argument. I'm going to focus on me because I'm not, he not here, so I'm not going to tell all his stuff. But what I will say is that it was a situation with something as simple as, it was snowing outside and people were double parking in front of the house and putting trash cans and stuff like this, so that they can keep their parking spot. And so one person double parked, right? A person double parked on our street. And of course, if you double park, sometimes it'll block the flow of people running up and down, driving up and down the street. Or it's a situation where a person's car can get hit. Now, here's the thing. You would, well, why would that person do that? And so on. So this was an older person, and this person probably was trying to get, into their house safely without having to walk all up and down the street. So these are all the things I'm thinking of. And so I was looking outside, just kind of watch to see if a parking space opens up. And so a parking space opened up. And so I went to go outside and go to that older neighbor's house to just tell them that a parking space just opened up. Let me hold it for you so that you can, get into that parking space. And so my husband and I got into this big argument because my husband was like, why are you doing that? Don't do that. They shouldn't have been dumb enough to open up, to double park anyway. But for me, being the person I am with the personality that I have, I was like, no, because I was reasoning in my mind why this person would do that because of their situation. So I was like, no, I'm going to tell them. And, and of course we went back and forth because he wouldn't have done it that way. Okay. I had something in mind in terms of what I wanted to do, but he wanted to do it another way. And so we got into this big argument that turned into a day of silence. Why do I say that? Sometimes it's important, and I can tell you stories of things that I've disagreed with him, and it was almost like we turned into this day or two of silence. Why am I saying that? Because we have to learn to respect the differences of others. Differences and difficulty does not mean that a relationship won't work, but you have to be willing to respect that other person handles things differently than you, and don't require people to handle stuff the way you would, because then that becomes controlling and manipulative. So we are talking about better. We are using the acronym better, and we first use with the letter B, which is balance. Understanding the balance and boundaries in relationship. There is a hierarchy. It's God, you, then others. You never put people where God should be. We're talking about deepening our relationships. A better me creates a better us, right? And so then we were talking about embracing the differences and difficulties in a relationship. Not all differences means that you're not going to have a good relationship. Learn or seek to understand that other person so that you know how they think, and you won't impose your thought patterns in the way that you would do things onto other people, because that's not fair. That leads to manipulation and control. Learn to respect and honor the differences. In relationships, you have introverts and extroverts. You guys handle things differently. You desire to be for an introvert, they may be perfectly fine in their home by themselves doing something on their own. Whereas the other person in a relationship is more gregarious. They're more outgoing. Don't make one or the other feel bad because they have different proclivities. Don't make the other person feel bad because they prefer something different than you. Learn to compromise. Maybe in relationships, you are the gregarious one. And so you like to attend parties and you like to go hang out with people. So guess what? Don't require your partner or that person that you're in a relationship to go to every event you go to, because it's unfair. It's one thing to compromise and say, okay, can you go here with me? And that other person to oblige you. But if you are a ripper and a runner and you like to be everywhere and be in everything, it's nothing wrong with that. You're gregarious. gregarious. You are outgoing. It's nothing wrong with that. But don't then go and require your introvert partner or your introvert friend or child to go on all of your excursions. Do you understand what I'm saying? Have you ever been guilty of that? Like, you got to go everywhere with me, and then you make that person feel bad because they just want to stay in the house and chill. You the one that want to rip and run everywhere, right? We're talking about relationships, and this is not just a romantic relationship, but it's also friendships. You know those friends that you have. You might be the outgoing one in your pack of friends. Don't expect and push everybody to do everything that you want them to do. Honor and respect and be willing to oblige them in some things that they would like to do that are maybe not as open and maybe not as involved as you would like. So it's really about embracing the differences. Now, the whole basis of what I'm talking about as it relates to deepening relationships has everything to do with the fruits of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 talks about the fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. These are the things that are the basis of deepening and having healthy and loving relationships. And I don't know about you guys, but I want to love more this year. I want to love harder. I want to learn to love even the difficult. Not that I have to tolerate and subject myself to things that are unhealthy for me, but it also means that I desire an intention to get better in my relationships. And so we're talking about E, which is embracing difficulties and differences. And so let's go to T, trusting more. How many of us are distrustful? Some of us have a hard time trusting people. I don't care if you've been in relationship with them for 20 years or for 2 months. Some of us struggle with trusting. And what I will say is that if you are a distrustful person, it will weaken the relationships that you involve yourself in. And so that T has everything to do with you learning how to trust more. A couple of weeks ago, I did a Facebook Live on risk, taking the risk and trusting again. Some of us have had some traumatic experiences in our lives that has prevented us from trusting. But when you fail to trust people in relationships, you weaken the relationship, and you also don't give that person the opportunity to be themselves. Why? Because you are expecting the negative as opposed to being open to what that person really may be or do. And so I am, and I don't know if this is because of the profession I'm in. I don't know if this is just my personality. I'm not sure. But I am not a naturally distrustful person. For me, you would have to do something in order for me to not trust you. So let me say that you would have had to have established a pattern in order for me not to trust you. But I do understand that some other people may be naturally distrustful and may believe that people have to earn their trust. Whichever perspective and wherever you are on that pendulum, what I will say to you is that trusting is a crucial and essential part of your relationships. When you struggle with insecurity, when you struggle with doubt and unbelief in relationships, it's going to be hard for you to look at that person purely, right? Because you're always thinking about what their motive is, or if what they're saying is true, or whether they're just saying that because they're talking to you. Is that you? When you're engaged in dialogue with people, are you in the back of your mind wondering and thinking, is this person telling the truth? They probably lying. Why they say that? They probably told somebody else something different. So all of these things are going on in our head. And what happens? It prevents us from connecting to that person because we are connected to distrust that was seeded in us in our previous relationships. We're talking about deepening relationships. If the person you're in relationship has never given you a reason to doubt them or to be distrustful towards them, then you have to be willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Why I say this? Because it will help with your relationship. It will help you to connect with them more. Yes, 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 yes. And it's so important for us to understand that when you are distrustful in relationships, there is a disconnect. A disconnect means that you are not connecting with them in the way that you should because you're always looking for the wall, for the rug to be pulled from under them. You are expecting them to do something to you that may have been done to you in the past. And so it's so important for us to understand that trust is something that should be required in a relationship. And again, in this description, it's just in the description of this discussion, it's not just about romantic relationships, but it's about relationships with colleagues, with your children, with your friends. You have to be able to trust people. And sometimes trusting people means simply this: I trust myself enough that if they do something to offend me, I will, if they do something to harm me and they prove to be unhealthy for me, I trust myself enough to remove me because it's better for me. And so now it goes back to what we were talking about with the letter B, in balance. I put God and myself before others, which means if you have proven to be an unhealthy connection, I trust myself enough to sever that connection for the benefit of me. But if you are the person that continuously remain in unhealthy and distrustful relationships because you refuse to set a boundary or you refuse to sever your ties from that relationship, you have to get better in that area. Because it's not about the other person, it then becomes about you and your unwillingness to let go of relationships that no longer serve you. And we talk about this a lot because this is where those resentments and continued unforgiveness and bitterness comes in, because we stay in relationships so too long, right? And we allow people to continue to do things to us that are unhealthy. And then once we get out of that relationship, we make somebody else who is unlike that pay for what the other person does. But really, we're making them pay for what we did to ourselves. And what did we do? We stayed in a relationship longer than we should have. And so that is then not fair to that other person. So we're talking about trust, removing the insecurity and the doubts that you have in these relationships. If a person has demonstrated that they are untrustworthy, then it is your responsibility to act accordingly. You act accordingly based upon their proof to you that they can't be trusted, right? Now, if they have not given you a reason, to be distrustful of them, then you really have to check the insecurities in you that breeds distrustfulness. Does that make sense? You have to check that in you. Some of us are extremely insecure. We may not admit it, but we're insecure. And so there is a fear that we carry in relationships that people are going to hurt us, that people are going to, betray our trust. And there is a insecurity, right, that people are going to expose our vulnerabilities. That's an insecurity in us. Because if that person hasn't demonstrated that pattern, then you are carrying that from another relationship. And so it's important for you to check your insecurities at the door. You know how like there's a coat check. Before you go into an event, you got to check your coat at the door. Well, I'm saying before you enter into relationships, you got to check your insecurities at the door. You have to recognize when some of that distrust is coming from a very weakened and vulnerable place in you. Okay, it is important for us to understand that because some of us are insecure and we won't admit it. We will make it about everybody else, right? Some of us are insecure because we're unhappy with the way that we appear, whether this is male or female. And so if you're in a relationship and a nice looking person walks by, I'm talking to male and female, that you might, instantly think that your partner or whoever you're with are looking at them in interest because of how you feel about you. And so we're talking about check your insecurity at the door. This deepens our relationships. When you recognize that being distrustful has nothing to do with that person and everything to do with your inability to sever relationships in the past that was not beneficial to you. We gain bitterness and distrustfulness. We gain resentment and anger and fear, right? When we do not look at the signs and symptoms and act accordingly. We can't always control how people treat us. But once they demonstrate a pattern of treating us negatively and interacting negatively towards us, then you have a decision to make. Once you make that decision, then it then becomes your reality. Now, if you choose to remain in a relationship that is unhealthy and not working for you, it is your choice. And so you have to begin to deal with the reality of that choice. And once that relationship ends and you go on to the next relationship, don't blame that other person and be distrustful and insecure with that other person because you failed to recognize the symptoms and act on it in your previous relationships. We're talking about deepening our relationships. A better me makes a better us. It's not just romantic relationships, but it's friendships. It's not just friendships, but it's with our children. It's with our colleagues and business partners. For those of us who are business owners, why would you be in partnership with someone you don't trust? Why would you be in business with someone that you have to second guess and you doubt every word that they say? That's not healthy. You got to check yourself at the door. Have they demonstrated patterns that make those thoughts a reality, or is that just you? That is an unhealthy reality to remain in. If you are in business and you don't trust those that you are partnering with, you have to check it at the door, right? And so that is trust, okay? So again, everything that I'm talking about, for those of you who are just coming on, everything that I'm talking about is coming from the acronym BETTER. And the basis of deepening our relationships has everything to do with the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5 and 22. We're talking about the fruits of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. This is my intention for 2021. A better me makes a better us. I want to love more and I want to learn to love better. And I know though, for those of you who are watching, you might feel the same way. And so we've talked about B, the letter B in better, which is balance and boundaries. We talked about embrace, embracing the differences and the difficulties in relationships, and removing the manipulation and control where we try to make people think and act the way we want them to. Trusting what we just stopped with, learning to remove the insecurities, the doubts, and the fears that rob us of the joy and peace that we can experience in our relationships. We're talking about a better me for a better us. Now, when we talk about these things, it's important for us to check ourselves first. One of the things that I talked about very early on in this segment is, hey, the ideal is that two people in a relationship work towards getting better. But I will say, and I have said to many of those that I work with, you focus on you. and watch the dynamics of that relationship change. Maybe they won't change for the whole or the good, maybe it won't change everything about the relationship, but it'll change you in the relationship. So, for those of us that are married, and I feel so strongly about this, and I say this a lot to my those that I work with who say my husband won't come to therapy, my wife won't come to therapy. I say, worry about yourself, and you sit down in that chair and you get you together, right? Because even in getting you together, it will change you in that dynamic, and it'll also bring clarity as it relates to the areas or the barriers in the relationship, and determine whether or not it's good for you to continue or not. Okay, but we're talking about focusing on yourself. And so the next T, because we said trust, the next T is temperament. We got to get our appetites and our attitudes together, guys. Some of us, we get in our little funky ways, and we have attitudes that really produce and lead to negative interactions in our relationships. How many of us struggle with that? Some of us are extremely moody. We are moody. We struggle with maybe dealing with things of the past that we have carried into our relationships, and it really creates a chaotic and sometimes tense environment in our relationships. Maybe we are irritable. Maybe we snap too quick and too fast. Maybe we don't give people, an opportunity to express themselves in appropriate ways. Maybe we overtalk people, and we're not respectful of the privacy and of the opinions and rights of other people. We're talking about temperament, dealing with our attitudes. And then the other thing is dealing with our appetites in our relationships. Let's talk about appetites, because some of us are, we struggle with greed and lasciviousness and wantonness, where we don't ever get enough of something, where it's never enough. Have you ever been in a relationship with someone where regardless of how hard you try, it's never enough? Like some of us, we struggle with, we struggle with these very draining characteristics that drain our relationships, and it pushes people away from us. Have you ever been a needy person? Sometimes we are tremendously needy, and it can be, it could be because of our trauma. It could be because of situations or scenarios in the past. But we require so much of a person. We put people where God and ourselves should be, and it really drains the relationship. And this is not just in romantic relationships, but it's also, in our relationships with our friends and with our children and business partners. Have you ever been in a relationship with someone who's just always negative? It always feel like you have to encourage them or pour into them, right? Why do I put this with temperance? I put this with temperance because we have to get to that place where we recognize and understand our work that's needed in the work of others. Like, we can't continue to displace our stuff onto other people. And we have to be temperate in our attitudes. We have to be temperate in our behaviors, that we don't displace and that we don't deflect and that we don't project our stuff onto other people, because it can become extremely draining. And we can drive people away because we need them. Some of us have this addiction to love, and it really sucks the life out of people, because it's like the more love we get, the more we want. And this comes from deep-seated insecurities and deep-seated feelings of abandonment and rejection. And whenever we struggle with those things, there is a proclivity for you to attach to a person in a relationship. And what happens in that relationship is that you put that person in that relationship where God should be. And so you sap them of everything that they have. Right now, there is a reciprocal in that because that person is allowing it. But why am I talking about temperate? I'm talking about becoming more temperate in our relationships, because not only do we have to learn the hierarchy of relationships, but we also have to understand what do we draw from people and what we are responsible for drawing from ourselves. Okay? We have to learn to be temperate in our relationships. Guys, we're talking that the basis of all of this is the fruits of the Spirit. Another part of being temperate in relationships has to do with dealing with those unhealthy appetites that you have. Some of us are tremendously lustful. Lustful is not just about sex and attraction, but it's also about this whole idea of envy, right? It's also about this idea of always wanting what you can't have, always wanting what other people have, right? And so when you're in a relationship and you are an envious person, it really robs that relationship of joy and peace, because you always want something, and you always want something that you don't have or that's not yours to have, right? These are characteristics that come from somewhere. They come from somewhere in us that maybe experience forms of trauma, maybe experience, different scenarios in our lives, and now it's present in our relationship. If you are a business partner and you are in business with someone who's tremendously lustful and struggles with greed, there is oftentimes a threat to your business, because when they're always striving to be something that they're not, or trying to look at different people, we're talking about lustful, we're talking about, just being greedy and, just really envy. All of that can be under one another. And so when you are in business with someone who's that way, that can create an instability in your business affairs, because it's like they're always trying to get more, and it might not be the season, it might not be the time, and it may not be for you or for your business model. And even as a friend, just those whole emotional requirements for someone who is envious and someone who struggles with lust and wanting it. All of these things rob us of the peace and joy in our relationships. When we talk about these appetites that we have, sometimes we are in relationships with people that they have challenges with unfaithfulness. Maybe they have a wandering eye. Maybe they have proven to have multiple partners, or they have proven to demonstrate patterns of infidelity. You have to decide whether or not this is a reality you want to remain in. Or if you are that person who struggles with infidelity and lust, you have to decide whether being committed to someone is conducive to what you want. Maybe you just need to be single. If you struggle with those things. And so when we start talking about being temperate, we have to begin to deal with our desires. And here's the thing, when I say wantonness, when I say infidelities, I'm not just talking about men, I'm talking about women too. Some of us are never satisfied, whether man or woman. And so if you know that you are just never satisfied in this one relationship is not going to satisfy you, then you have to step back and begin to deal with those appetites in you that will prevent you from being satisfied, because it's not the other person, it's not the people. Sometimes we have these ideas in relationships that, okay, if this person would do this, then maybe I wouldn't have a wandering eye, or if this person do this, maybe I would be committed. That's not always the case. Sometimes there is something in us, right, that prevents us from being faithful and from being committed. And I always tell those that I work with, if you have a wandering eye, if you like your if you like your multiples, then you need to stay by yourself. You need to choose not to commit because you haven't gotten to the frame of mind where you want to commit. Sometimes we commit to relationships because we think it's the right thing to do, as opposed to it's really what we want to do. And so we're talking about checking your appetites and really looking at your attitude, those things in relationships that will rob us of healthy relationships. You know, if you are never satisfied, don't require your partner to satisfy you if you know they can't. You know, how many times have we been in relationships with people and it feels like the more we give, the more they want? Has anybody been in a relationship like that before? The more they give, the more they want of you. And it's like, I did this, you still want more. Maybe we've been like that in relationships. If that is the case, we got to check ourselves. We're talking about a better me makes a better us. If this is you, you have to check the deficits in your character. You have to check the deficits in your thinking patterns that really prevents you from being satisfied. Some of us don't experience satisfaction, contentment, and fulfillment because we're not in the relationship that we need to be in, whether that is with God, with ourselves, or with the other person. Some of us will never be satisfied because we're not doing what we should do. We're not making the decisions that we should make. Does that make sense? And so, you know, we really have to look at ourselves and really put that microscope on ourselves and our relationships. And so the next letter is empathy. It's E for empathy. So we talked about balance and boundaries. We talked about embracing differences and difficulties. We talked about trusting, getting rid of the insecurity, getting rid of the doubt and unbelief that governs our relationships. Now we're going to talk, and we talked about temperance, dealing with the appetites and attitudes that are counterproductive in our relationships. You know, those appetites that really breeds an inability to be satisfied or content in our relationships. And then the other letter that I want to talk about is empathy. You know, some of us do not practice empathy in our relationships. We're not empathetic, right? And so what happens is we don't ever look at things or attempt to look at things from the lens of the other person, because it's all about what we want. It's all about the way we see things, but it's never about seeking to understand. Empathy has everything to do with you investing in understanding that other person's perspective. Empathy is an investment that you make in relationships where it's not just about you, but you consider the thoughts and the feelings and the perspectives of another person. You know, you be willing to see things from their perspective. I can see why you would think that way, even if it is total disagreement from what you think. You have to be able to look at it from the lens of that other person. Empathy breeds connection. When we have the ability to connect to people, we have an understanding. When there is a connection, there is oftentimes an understanding of why that person thinks the way they think. And we can respect it and honor it more because we see them from their perspective and not from where we think they should be. And this is such a threat to our relationships because many of us are not empathetic. We're not. You know, we are only seeing things from our perspective, and we demonstrate an inability to consider the thoughts and feelings of someone else. People are not always wrong because they don't agree with you. It could be a different perspective. And we have to incorporate this in our marriages. We have to incorporate this with our children. We have to incorporate this, in our business affairs, on our jobs. It don't always have to be your way. And some of us are tremendously self-centered. We are self-centered and self-serving. Now, I started off with balance and saying that God first, you second, and then all others after that. But that doesn't mean that you don't demonstrate an ability to compromise, that you don't demonstrate a genuine respect and regard for the opinion and the perspectives of another person. And so we're talking about deepening our relationships. And the way that we deepen our relationships is by demonstrating empathy. Stop placing or stop, projecting your thoughts and opinions and perspectives onto someone else and demonizing people because they don't think the way you think. And this happens a lot in our marriages. It happens a lot, with our adult children. Because there are differences in opinion as adult, and I'm talking our adult children, sometimes we don't demonstrate empathy and look at it from their perspective because we feel like we're the parents of these adult children and we know better. A part of being empathetic has to do with being able to be an active listener, having the ability to listen to other people, listen and hear with the intention to gain a better understanding. Okay, so these things are key as it relates to deepening our relationship. And we're still coming from the basis of love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. When it comes to empathy, some of us are not gentle. We're so hard. We are quick to, condemn and come down on people because of their differences, because, of their perspectives. And we have to learn to be more gentle. We have to learn to be more kind to other people and not be so judgmental. Some of us struggle with being judgmental. And it robs us of the joy and peace that we can experience in our relationships. For those of us who live by principles, right? Some of us are very principled in nature. And so we have some very hard and very fine boundaries, right? And so when other people may not, their boundaries or their way of thinking is not as rigid as ours, we often tend to judge them and put them in categories. And it's important for you, if you are that person, it's important for you to be more gentle and kind with those that you're in relationships. Stop judging people. Learn, ask God to help you, to help you deal with that judgmental part of your personality. I know what it's like to be judgmental. I was judgmental for a while, and it, earlier in my walk with God. Why? Because I was, rigid in my thinking. And for me, it's like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. If you don't do these things, then you wrong. If you don't do this, then you're not living right. If you don't do this, and it doesn't bring into regard people's perspectives, their experiences, their backgrounds. And so when you recognize that you are judgmental, you can do something about it. I had to admit to myself that I was very judgmental. People ain't want to be around me or talk to me because they knew I was going to judge them. You understand what I'm saying? And it's not, this is something, if it is part of your personality, that you can grow to get better in. Sometimes in our relationships with our spouses don't want to tell us nothing. We always wonder why there's a lack of communication in our relationships. Maybe it's because you're too darn judgmental. Maybe it's because if they tell you their thoughts, they know that you're going to shut them down. Whether this is in a relationship with boyfriend, girlfriend, whether it is, your adult children, whether it is, in your marriages, whatever it is. Sometimes people avoid you because they know you always got something to say. and you always got something, that you want to let them know that they wrong, right? I mean, I'm only being honest because I've been there, done that. And I start feeling some kind of way when people don't want to talk to me. So then you got to check yourself. What is it about you in relationships that really drives people away? And some of you might say, I'm not judgmental. I've never been that way. Or some of you might say, I do struggle with being judgmental. This is something that I have to get better with. But I think that it's so important for us to recognize the areas in our relationships where we can get better so that we can deepen them. Again, we're talking about what? Creating, a better me creates a better us. It makes a better us because I am focusing on changing the things in me that poses as a threat to the relationships, and we can talk about being judgmental even in as business partners. Some of us, we have business partners and we think differently. Maybe you have different perspectives, right? And that business partner come to you with ideas and, what if we do it this way? And you quick to shut them down and you make people think that, their ideas are not just as good as yours. And some people, you might not mean to do it, but it could be a part of your personality that just has to be refined. And so if that is you, it's just something that you need to work on. Some of us are judgmental and it comes from a place. It comes from an experience. It comes from, things that may have happened, choices that we may have made. And so when we talk about the E in better, we are talking about learning to be empathetic, learning to demonstrate empathy in our relationships. And so the last one that I want to talk about is respect. Okay. Now, going from the very beginning, I started off with the acronym better. I talked about balance and boundaries. I talked about E being embracing, learning to embrace the difficulties and the differences in relationships. I talked about trust, the T for trust, learning to be trusting of other people and removing the insecurities, the doubts, and the unbeliefs that destroy relationships. Becoming more temperate, dealing with those appetites and attitudes in our lives that act as a threat to our relationships. And then what I just talked about was demonstrating empathy, being more empathetic to those that you're in relationships with and destroying this whole judgmental thing. Some of us are judgmental and we have to stop it. And so the last one is R. And R is for respect. It has everything to do with learning to adore and learning to admire those that you are in relationships with. Respect has everything to do with you honoring the dignity, the perspective, and placing people in a high regard. Regardless of what you think of people, people deserve respect. Even if they are different than you, if they look different than you, if they have different thoughts and feelings and experiences than you have to respect people and not diminish people. Some of us, and we talked about being judgmental. Some of us, when it comes to respect, we talk to people in a very belittling way, in a very condescending way, in our marriages, in our friendships, with our children, in our businesses and on our jobs. Some of us are extremely presumptuous. We think we know people and we don't. You cannot assume that you know people when they haven't shared them. When they haven't expressed to you who they are. You can have an idea, but don't be presumptuous. Don't think that you know more than you know. So when it comes to respecting people, you have to respect the position, the place. You have to respect the personhood of that person. And some people say, well, respect is earned and not given. Well, if that's your perspective, then I want you to be very careful, because when you are in these relationships, It is important for you to respect people. You respect them even if you don't agree with them. I have found, and one thing that I have been teaching for years is this one key principle: communication does not require my agreement. Communication only requires my active listening. That's it. If we are in a relationship and there is a dialogue and there is communication going on where there are perspectives being presented, I am not required to agree with that person. I'm not. But I should, if I'm in a relationship and there's a connection, I should be required to hear them and to listen. And that is something that oftentimes we have done so wrong in relationships, because we always think we got to agree with someone or someone got to agree with us. We don't, that when we are two people coming from two different perspectives and two different realities, maybe our personalities are very different. We're not going to agree. Why require someone to see something your way? That's not healthy. And it also doesn't, it also doesn't speak to the valuing the differences in opinions. Respect also has to do with valuing the stance and the position of another person. I don't agree. I would not do it that way, but I'm not going to talk down at you and make you think that you stupid because you have a thought and you have a way of doing things that I'm not in agreement with. And sometimes we can be very condescending and belittling in our communication. And it damages our relationships, and it prevents people from even wanting to talk to us. And that is something, that you have to be honest with yourself. If that is something that you struggle with, you got to be honest with yourself with that. Some of us have these, personalities where we are better than, we can be extremely prideful, where our way is the right way and nobody else's way is right. That is a form of pride. And we have to be very careful with that. We have to be very careful when we are engaging in conversations and connections with those, around us. Don't talk to people like they don't know if you don't know they don't know. Have you ever been in a relationship with people like that? It's almost like they have a very condescending way of talking to you. And so it's kind of like it's always like they know something that you don't. Have you ever interacted with that kind of person, or do you struggle with that? It can be very patronizing, and it can definitely ruin that genuine kind of communication and connection that you desire in relationships. We're talking about respecting, being able to respect the experiences, being able to respect, the thoughts and opinions of someone else, even if you don't agree. And again, I'll say it if I have to say it every day. And oftentimes in my practice, I say it a lot. Communication does not require agreement. It does not. But seek to understand, seek to hear the other person and the perspective by which that other person is coming from. Now, here's the deal. If you present your perspective and they can connect with that perspective, and then they say, you know what, you're on to something, then you have gained something. You have helped a person to see something from another perspective. But when you shut them down and belittle them and be judgmental of their perspective, you often shut the ability to be impactful in their lives, because they'll just cut you off. So again, sometimes being gentle and patient, sometimes seeking peace, has a lot to do with really having the result of winning someone over. Because I really believe that if you're in conversation with someone and someone has their perspective and then you present your perspective, if that person is open enough, or even if you're open enough, that other person can get you to see things from a perspective that you never saw it before, which could then improve you for the better. And so when we talk about being open in our conversations and being respectful in our dialogues, it helps us to be open so that we can improve. And sometimes you might think that the other person is wrong, and come to find out, maybe you could not have been looking at things from an open perspective. And so respect has everything to be with being open. It has everything to do with honoring the position and the perspective of another person and not requiring people to think the way you think. Guys, I'm talking about a better me makes a better us. Can you say that? Like, can you say that in all of the things that we talked about, that we talked about since we've been on, there are some things that you can work on, that we can work on to be better in our relationships. Before I end, I'm going to go back to the acronym. The acronym is better. We're talking about demonstrating balance and boundaries in our relationship. It's God, you, and then others. Don't ever put other people or put yourself in a position that God should be in your life. We're talking about E for embrace. Embracing the differences and the difficulties in relationship. Just because there are differences and difficulties, it doesn't mean that the relationship is unhealthy. Just embrace them. Trust. Removing insecurity, fears, and doubts from relationships and learning to trust those. And learning to trust yourself in relationships, because when you recognize that this is no longer healthy for you, you are able to remove yourself or set boundaries. The other thing has to do with temperance, being temperate in our relationships, checking your appetites and your attitudes in relationships. Some of us have unhealthy appetites that is displaced on those that we're in relationships with. And we got to deal with it. We got to deal with that greed and that lust and that envy that we carry. We have to deal with those things. So being temperate. And then the other thing that we talked about was empathy. Being able, to put yourself in other people's shoes, being able to seek to understand as opposed to seek to change, but really to seek to understand the perspectives and the opinions of other people and treat people with dignity and with regard. And then lastly is respect, honoring people, adoring and admiring, being respectful of people's position and their perspectives. These are things that we really have to get better in. Not being presumptuous and judgmental, not being so rigid in our thinking that we are not open to the differences and perspectives of other people, not being belittling and condescending and patronizing to other people, but respecting other people's their stances, respecting other people's opinions. Like, these are things that are so important, guys, and they damage our relationships. When pride is in our relationship, it destroys our connections. And so it is so important for us to really, be clear on all of these things. Again, a better me makes a better us. Let's deepen our relationships in 2021.